President Biden just got some super fuel with Democrats greenlighting Senate plans to bypass Republican obstruction so they can get Biden's big infrastructure a party line vote where it could pass. In fact, that means the $2 trillion program could pass just like the way they passed COVID relief if you have all 50 Senate Democrats and Vice President Harris doing the tiebreaker without any Republicans in Congress. And that pits Mitch McConnell against his own Republican voters who strongly backed the COVID bill. And many Republican voters, are now warming to the new Biden bill, a trend that he pointed out.
I have electoral support from Republican voters. Unless Mitch says the last thing I did, this last piece of legislation is so far left, well, then he ought to take a look at his party. Over 50% of them must be over that edge as well, because they support what I did.
They do support it. Now Republican voters are increasingly not very well represented by their party's reflexive opposition in Washington, as more Republican voters lean towards Biden policies, at least in these first 70 days, which raises an important prospect. Could Biden be to the Republican Party what Reagan was to the Democratic Party, a leader who found a way to build a following with some of the other party's voters, regardless of the D.C. politicians?
In Detroit today, the head of the United Auto Workers, a union traditionally allied with the Democrats, said there's a notable increase of support for Ronald Reagan among rank-and-file auto workers.
Union leaders say support for Ronald Reagan among auto workers is growing as fast as the unemployment lines.
The commercials appeal directly to working people who have traditionally voted Democratic.
Well, this time, I am going to vote. And you better believe it won't be for the Democrats.
Many conservative Democrats and independents have already got the man they like, and it is Ronald Reagan.
That phenomenon was originally dubbed Reagan Democrats by Stanley Greenberg, a pollster for top Democrats and President Clinton. It's a history many remember and one that Biden lived through as a senator. Transformative presidents tend to grow coalitions. Reagan won his presidential elections with over a quarter of registered Democrats backing him, which powered his 49-state landslide in 1984, just as Obama turned red states blue, like Virginia and Indiana. Now, it's early in Biden's tenure. He does not yet have Reagan-level cross-party support. Just under 1 out of 10 Republicans voted for Biden nationally. At the state level, there were signs he won over Trump Republicans in places like Michigan. And the pollster who tracked Reagan Democrats said this went beyond any personal appeal, finding Democrats in that same state, Michigan, who backed Reagan, were blue collar. They were for government spending on health care. But they thought leaders in their own Democratic Party were focused more on equal rights than mortgage payments and more focused on black voters in Detroit and the protesters on campus than on pocketbook issues. So part of that playbook was the continued realignment of Republican support along racial lines and Nixon's Southern strategy. But in terms of how politics works, many operatives also see a broader dynamic here that could benefit Joe Biden today. And it's pretty straightforward. When the incumbent party leaders lose step with their own voters, they're obviously more vulnerable to challenges. That same pollster now sees the prospect of Biden Republicans who also live in the suburbs, but are highly educated, open to diversity, more concerned with the GOP's recent lurches under Trump and towards a more nativist and less policy-oriented party, one that storms the Capitol. And they're concerned about that, which means in politics, the right leader can invade that partisan Republican turf to pick off voters. So a Reagan or Biden could brashly waltz right into the opposing party's tent, and like the iconic swashbuckling oil tycoon character Daniel Plainview from There Will Be Blood, can walk right up to the other party, pause, straw in hand, and just drink your milkshake.
If you have a milkshake, and I have a milkshake, and I have a straw, there it is. And my straw reaches across the room and starts to drink your milkshake. I drink your milkshake.
Now, this is the news. So we ask the hard questions around here. Can Biden really drink McConnell's milkshake? Well, he seems increasingly confident about it, openly touting his Republican support the way that Reagan turned his own appeal to Democrats into a kind of a recurring narrative.
All those millions of Democrats and independents who I know are looking for a cause around which to rally and which I believe we can give them. There was once upon a time that to be a Republican in this area of the country felt a little bit like being Gary Cooper in High Noon, outnumbered in a big way. I hope that you, who are independents and Democrats, will let me talk to you also tonight, because the problems facing our country are problems that just don't bear any party label.
Biden was there through all of that as a senator, and he clashed with Republicans plenty, but also found time to work with that president. There he was, smiling with President Reagan in the Oval Office and trying to forge common ground on the economy after Reagan's 1983 State of the Union.
President, I think, for the first time acknowledged, A, the depth of the economic crisis, and B, the need for government to be involved in the solution.
And that was back when policy sometimes brought politicians together. Today's Republican politicians, they're not like that at all. I mean, they literally just spent the last 4 years claiming to back spending for infrastructure as Trump held 10 different infrastructure weeks, and now they've flip-flopped to oppose infrastructure spending, all because Biden supports it.
If the Republicans argue that we don't need infrastructure, it need not. They've been talking about the need for it for years now.
We are jeopardizing the future of this country by continuing to engage in this kind of deficit spending. I can't imagine that's going to be very appealing to many Republicans.
I mean, they said it was appealing for 4 years. That's the Republican politicians. But then you have the voters. 1 out of 5 Republican voters are already backing Biden's new infrastructure bill. Most Republican voters backed Biden's COVID recovery bill. And the split between those voters and their partisan representatives in D.C. is clear. Indeed, outside of D.C., there are even local Republican politicians who came out for that bill.
According to the polls, there is overwhelming bipartisan support.
It's not just Republican governors who are supporting the relief bill and asking for Biden's help. Republican-led cities and towns are seeking aid.
So many of our mayors have come out on both sides of the aisle because this is just the right thing to do.
400 mayors have come out and said they support this package. That's why Democratic and Republican governors have come out and said that.
True. Now it's early. But if Biden continues like this, he may keep cornering these D.C. Republican politicians by drinking their electoral milkshake. And you know what happened to some of those Reagan Democrats? Well, they kept voting Republican and eventually kind of became Republicans. Can Joe Biden, with his diverse cabinet and his coalition and the signs of an increasingly broad governing economic agenda, can he do the same? Can he turn his Biden Republicans into Democratic teammates? Well, it's early, but there's new nonpartisan Gallup polling out today that finds the largest spike in people affiliating as Democrats in a decade. When asked the party that they either back or lean, now fully half of voters are Democratic, a big spike to 49%. Republicans, meanwhile, are down to 40%. Well, even after Reagan left office, his political realignment lived on. Politicos and reporters would track the impact of those Reagan Democrats in elections that went on even after Reagan's final term.
These quiet neighborhoods on Chicago's southwest side are the battleground for independents and Reagan Democrats, the home of auto workers, steelmen, firemen, and cops.
Reagan Democrats are largely blue-collar ethnic voters in the north and working-class whites in the south. They comprise about 10% of the electorate nationally and could tip the balance in 10 key states, including the battleground of the industrial Midwest.
Everyone wanted to see what they would do. Now, if you're old enough to remember the last presidential election, you might recall that even though Trump got fewer votes than Clinton in 2016, there were all these reporters and all these think pieces probing the minds of those Trump supporters out there in America. Well, real talk. Joe Biden recently thumped Donald Trump by a wider margin. He's now thumping McConnell with Republican support for huge federal spending. And I don't know about you, but I don't hear as much from the D.C. pundits about trying to learn the thinking of those Biden voters out there in real America, in the heartland, the women of color or the suburban populace or the public service workers. It is funny how the D.C. pundit empathy always seems to be so one-sided. Now, again, I can't stress enough how it is too early to know if Biden would be heading for a realignment years from tonight. But I can tell you this when you take it all together. Right now, he's winning over a broad coalition for big spending and big New Deal type programs. And he has some Republicans backing him. And that means right now, Mitch McConnell also keeps losing. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.